Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to kind of trickle in before we get started. Good evening, everyone. It is just about 6:32, so I will get started, and I'm sure more people will be joining us shortly. So hello, everyone. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know, as I'm sure you've seen, that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's Facebook and YouTube pages, as well as our website, dyckmanfarmhouse.org, after today. So welcome back, everyone, to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series, talking about Race Matters, Join the Conversation. My name is Meredith Horsford, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are so excited to continue this lecture series that began in August of 2020, which was so successful that we've continued it as a biannual series. So thank you to those of you who are returning to us tonight, and welcome to any newcomers. This series was created at a time of great unrest in this country due to the murder of unarmed Black people, as well as the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in conversation on a topic that can sometimes be uncomfortable. This is a 3-week series which is centered around food culture and decolonizing food, how Black content creators have been able to disseminate information digitally, and how food is ingrained in cultural traditions. I wanted to point out a few things on Zoom to ensure that you get your questions and comments answered. Please make sure that you are muted, first of all. And if you would like to say hello to any of the other attendees, please feel free to do so in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. Also, if you have any technical assistance questions, you can ask those in the chat as well, and Caroline, our digital content and programs coordinator, can answer those questions for you. During the lecture, if you have any questions for our speaker, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom or ask them in the chat, and we will answer those questions at the end. The Dykeman Farmhouse Museum would like to thank everyone for participating in our first presentation of this fall's Talking About Race Matters lecture series. The overwhelming response to this lecture series makes it clear that there is a need for platforms that allow us to talk about issues that divide us and issues that unite us as Americans. The Dykeman team believes that our programming should be accessible to all. This means that we strive to make as many of our programs as possible free of charge. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support this mission. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. Tonight, we are joined by Lavada Nahon, culinary historian and interpreter of African American history for the New York State Bureau of Historic Sites. For many, the idea of decolonizing our lives includes eating like our ancestors, but what if we have no idea what your ancestors ate? How far back does one look for those ancestors? When and how did the world's foods get so mixed up? In this short program, Lavada will look at the global food and eating exchanges of the 17th and 18th centuries and their lingering impact on what we eat today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lavada Nahon, presenting the impact of the age of exploration on what we eat. Thank you, Lavada.
Thank you, Meredith. And I want to thank Caroline and everyone at the Dykeman Farmhouse. If you'll give me a moment, we're just going to do the whole setting up to share. Okay, so why are you not going to the first screen? There we go. Excellent. So for this evening, I really want this just to be a conversation, and we're going to go through just a short chat around world history, a lot of which we probably learned in school. And a lot of it, maybe we do know the highlights and we don't kind of remember the details, but I'm just going to kind of go over the highlights. I often find myself telling people that to understand what's happening in the 17th and 18th century, we need to go back a little further. So we need to go back to about the 10th century. And even probably further back for humankind. Here on the screen, we have just a basic world map. On my right, the area with Africa and Asia and Australia tucked down there because this is a map laid flat. Africa, Europe, going over into the Middle East and Asia and those islands are considered the old world. And on my left, when we have the Americas and the Caribbean and West Indies islands tucked out in there and all of the things at the top of Canada, that's considered the new world. And for literally thousands of years, people looked to the old world, where the riches were, where silks industry, all of that knowledge came from the old world. And that really impacted what happened around food. So before 1492, food, plants, animals, fungi, fruit trees, nuts, all the kind of stuff, really traveled within the region where they were native. If there was movement, that movement was caused by trade between people and tribes. So like one village to the next village, or if one village has a lot or tribe has a lot of fish, maybe they'll trade it with somebody else. We have too much fish, you've got too many nuts, let's do a swap. Movement was caused by waste because what we consumed, birds, humans, seeds and all, where we defecated, it would be left and those plants would travel that way. We know that some seeds are airborne, like dandelion, right? We blow on it and they go all over. So seeds get caught in the air and they travel that way. Seed pods get caught in rivers and streams and the currents and they move that way. But they generally stayed in their zone. That started, however, to change once we get into discovery of the New World. What really makes this possible? That starts in the 14th and 15th century. The biggest impact is the building of ocean-going vessels. The Portuguese start that process with the caravel. Not only did they have to then build a ship, but they also had to learn to navigate the currents of the oceans and the winds, because they could go like towards Africa, but they discovered that they couldn't come back, right? So all of that period of going around the world, Portugal was the first one to really start out and get around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and go up by Madagascar and over to the Indian Ocean to open trade. But how do they even know to be able to do this? Well, actually, it goes to the period of time when we have the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads were started by China. We're talking very early, like 700, 800 AD, and then they start putting their products out there. But over the years, over the centuries, as the Mongols moves and China's moves and all of these things and these people and the Arab world and India, they're trading back and forth, sharing languages and goods. They're doing that very slowly. They're doing that by camel caravans. They're putting things on wagons in some places, but it's slow movement. But it starts to move around the world, and some of it starts to trickle off into Europe. There is a point where the Pope decides that Europeans also need to go rescue Jerusalem. And so we get to that period where there are all these papal bulls and all these Europeans go off and they're going to be knights in shining armor and they're going to go rescue Jerusalem. Excuse me, I'm going to back up for a bit to the from the infidels. And even though the wealthy, the kings and queens in some European countries and some other Asian countries knew that there was riches there, the common man did not. And it is not until we get into the Crusades where the common man starts to see and taste the luxuries of the East. As we come back from the Crusades, the Roman Church is starting to really push trades. It is the Venetians, really, who have crossed the Mediterranean before the Portuguese get started. They've joined the Camel Roads because they're right there, closer to them than other parts of Europe. So they're bringing these things back. But the merchants, well, you want to trade, then you must have more gold, you must have more money, you must have more wealth. And then curiosity about how to do it faster, how to access it, how to get things beyond those just in the castles and on top. How do we get this into the greater community? How do we get these spices? How do we get these fruits and foods and this silk? And how do we get these fineries? That drives Portugal to develop this ship. That drives King Leopold, I believe is his name, of Portugal, to go in there and send his men. So they start bringing things back. And as those voyages start, late 14th century, early 15th century. They're into Africa, they're into India. They go in initially with their goods to trade, and the merchants of the old world say, this is nice, but we're not interested in your things. Is this all you have? Do you have anything else? And they leave. They're not as successful, but they come back 2 years later with gunboats and cannons on their ship, and they're forced their way into the trade. And then all this trade via Portugal's wealth starts going into Europe, and their neighbors are like, whoa, what about their ships? Well, maybe we need to work on our ships. Well, let's work on our ships. Okay. And then right behind them, we have Spain. Right behind Spain, we have the Netherlands. Right behind the Netherlands, we have England. And France is slowly getting their navy together. They're the least successful of the colonies, the countries at this point. But in that exploration, they start to bring the spices, probably the least non-perishable things, the wealth, the fabrics, the things, they bring those back into Europe. And in trying to get more, of course, we know what happens, right? They say, well, we got to find a shorter route. We can get there quicker. How do we get around there faster? And so they head westward, and they end up here in the Americas. Once that trade route, particularly starting after Columbus, is named after Columbus, it's called the Columbian Exchange. It refers to not just Columbus's single voyage, but all of these countries trying to get to a shorter way to the old world, discovering the new world, discovering new products, new foodstuffs, a new area that's green and rich, a new peoples. This is considered the largest part of a more general process, right, of biological globalization. And it follows the transoceanic voyages of exploration in the 15th and 16th century. They are moving things around. They're moving the things that they are interested in from the old world over to the new world, and then they're going to go back and forth. And so what does this mean? First of all, it's bounty. What did you discover on your trip, right? So they bring back a bag or bags of beans. They give it to the king and queen. The king and queen then gives them out to their friends. And before you know it, we have American goods starting to filter out. But there are things in the old world that they want too. One of those things is sugar. But the sugar is controlled by the Arabs. So some Spanish guys go over there, they steal some sugar cane, they take it first to the Madeira Islands and the Canary Islands. And then once they have this new world, same growing region, they just move it over there. So slowly, things are starting to relocate in a way that they have never done in human history. So first we have a slow movement from camel caravans, Europe going to the west, to the Middle East, India and Asia, following the Silk Roads, following Jerusalem. Then the Americas were found. The second part is colonization. Now we have this new land. Now we can claim it. At first, that fight was between Portugal and Spain. The Netherlands, England, and France were a little behind, right? Because Portugal and Spain are right there together. They're right on the water. They got their ships together and they were out moving around. So it gets to be this tug of war to the point that they go to the Pope and the Pope says, okay, here's the deal, guys. You're both Roman Catholics. We're going to just like split the world. You get this side, you get this side, and stay that way. But of course, we know it doesn't stay that way. And they go back and forth. In that movement, we start in the 15th and 16th century with just the explorations. We get into the period of the 17th century when we have colonization. Colonization is happening in the New World. Colonization is happening in the Old World. Everyone of Europe is trying to dominate and take over. And as they do that, food starts to move. Why? Because the ships start from their native lands, filled with food to feed them on these voyages. When they get to the New World, they do their exploring, but they also have to eat to get back. So the foods they're gathering serves two purposes. It's not just about trade. They also have to survive the trip back. So what kind of foods from the Americas starts to become part of this mix? The most dominant is maize. And corn that we're referring to at this point is not the sweet corn that most of us consider. It is actually corn that is meant to be dried. It is either washed and limed and used that way as we would do hominy, or it's ground into corn and used cornmeal. Potatoes get moving, sweet potatoes get moving, cassava gets moving, chocolate gets moving, not the bar, but definitely for the drink. Chili peppers, hot chili peppers take off. Pumpkins, things like Concord grapes and plums, they're eating on the voyages, but they can't maintain the product, but they can have the seeds. Our nuts start moving. Peanuts, pecans, black walnuts. Black walnuts are prized furniture wood, so that gets moving. Hickories, sunflower seeds, quinoa, pineapples, right? Pineapples ultimately become so popular around the world that they become symbols of friendship and home. The berries and turkeys take off also, very much like corn, because the largest bird that was available to the Europeans to eat was a swan. And now they have these turkeys available. We look to see what's happening in our area here, and we're in New Netherlands, and we know a lot about our movement of food in these areas because of a book called A Description of New Netherlands, written by Adrian van der Donk. Van der Donk was in New Netherlands in the 17th century, came as a lawyer and a sheriff for Rensselaerwyck, which is now up around Albany. He ends up in the New Amsterdam, down in what is now New York City area. He becomes part of the government. Anyway, he ends up in Holland. A war starts between the Netherlands and England. He can't come back. So while he is there for about 2.5 years, he writes this amazing sales pitch for New Netherland. Throughout A Description of New Netherland, we have all of this information around foods. He talks about what is native. He has learned, he's one of the few people that are fluent in several of the native tongues. He spent a lot of time with the natives. He talks about what the settlers brought over. We know that the Dutch, even beginning with the initial settlers of the Walloons who came through the Netherlands and settled and were the first people actually settled in New Amsterdam area. He talks about everything. So we know the garden produce in New Netherlands are very numerous. Some of them have been known to the natives from the earliest times, and others introduced from different parts of the world, but chiefly from the Netherlands. So immediately, those 17th century Dutch settlers are picking up things like maize and pumpkin. We know that sampan, which is cornmeal mush with milk in the 17th century, was a favorite supper dish for the Dutch. So they're already using those native products, putting them into their gardens, putting them into their fields, but they're also starting to mix it. Various kinds of salads and cabbages and parsnips, carrots, beets, endives, broccoli, cauliflower, cucumbers, eggplant, sorrel, dill, all of the things that we actually still eat on the day-to-day now. Cresses and onions and leeks. And there's so much that he says, besides what is everly commonly found in a kitchen garden. The herbs, rosemary, thyme, marjoram, all of those things that are used in Dutch cooking, various other things which I have bestowed no attention because there's so much. They also are bringing over animals. So we get pigs, we get goats, we get sheep, we get cattle, we get oxen to eat, oxen to work and eat. Horses, donkeys, and mules and the oxen make doing the fields faster and easier. So they're not edible, but they're helping with this growing process. From Africa, during this time, 17th into the 18th century, we're starting to get into the transatlantic slave trade, and the same thing happens. Ships leave from the Americas full of food from here. They have to go over to Africa, and they don't just get there, load up folks, and leave. They actually can spend anywhere from 2 to 4 months going up and down the African coastline, trading for food, stocking up the ships, getting enough provisions so that the enslaved will have something to eat on the way back. From Africa, some of the things that end up here are okra, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, African rice, millet sorghum, guinea pepper, ackee, pigeon peas, coffee, cola nuts. What ends up there, because in Africa, the dominant, they're not doing wheat, right? The wheat is native to Europe. Their grains, rice, millet, sorghum, and the yam harvest often take a long time. They need a product to grow faster that will feed people and get going. So they actually move from the New World, cassava, over to Africa. They move corn over to Africa. And those crops are still now in Africa competing with getting farmers to grow indigenous grains, because the amount of labor it takes to grow corn is so little. It will thrive both and definitely in dry climates. So all of that, so that exchange affects through this process of the things that I have read over the years. It really, there's some things that I find real fun and amazing. Like chili peppers took off. There was one point in the 18th century where documents speak to like all of the peppers, powdered peppers being sold in Indian markets, all being red because chili peppers have gotten so popular. When we eat Korean food today, one of the foods that I love, we talk about kimchi. How do we imagine kimchi without chili peppers in it? But in fact, kimchi was originally done just with salt. They were white, they were clear, they weren't red, they weren't spicy. So all of those peppers that quickly flooded the world because that was a taste that everyone enjoyed. All of this mixture back and forth of ingredients has been going on for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's based on the climate where things can grow. There are a number of things here on the African list that we don't have in our area here in New York, but you will find them in the South. You will find them in South America. You find them in Central America. You find them in the Caribbean and West Indies, because that's the same growing zone. So when we think of something, even like, we'll go back to some of the greens, oops, sorry, wrong direction. Some of the greens that Van de Donk speaks to, Sorry about that. We're in the cabbage area. Our greens are mustard greens and turnip greens. Remember, this is Dutch, so this is what ends up in our garden. And in that mixing, we say, well, how do we get collard greens up here? How do we get all of these yams up here? It's like yam now, you go into a grocery store in our area, particularly a main grocery store, that's a large sweet potato. To get an African yam, one either grown in Africa or in the Caribbean West Indies, you have to go what most consider an ethnic market, be that Hispanic, Latino, somewhere Brazilian, or African markets where you can actually get a true yam here. So that mixing started very, very early and continues even to this day. So when we think about decolonizing our food, in the food trends, one of the things that is very popular is eating like your ancestors, right? Old food ways. But what does that mean? Right. So for me, as someone who is an African in America, I did my DNA. I know that I'm 85% Congolese. Like I have a choice. Am I going to eat like my family did in Texas growing up? Or am I going to step into the slave years where we know all of those held in bondage were grossly underfed? Or am I going to step back into Africa? Am I going to go into Central Africa, West Africa? Am I going to go to the Western part, right? So when we think about decolonizing or eating like our ancestors, we actually have a choice. I was speaking to a friend today, a colleague, and she said, they say, eat like your grandparents, right? So I would eat like my grandparents. They were farmers in Texas. So that my base grain was corn. So I had cornbread every day as my daily bread. Pinto beans was my bean of choice because that's what grows in hot Texas heat. We ate shorter, the greens we ate changed because of the heat in Texas, right? So those things. But one of the things she said really caught me up. But what if you're 20 years old and your grandparent is only like 50 years old? Would you choose to eat what was popular in the 70s and 60s or even in the 50s? Are you going to eat frozen foods or where we're stepping into canned goods at that point heavily as the big superstores, the grocery stores are starting to thrive and grow? You have to consider, did your people raise cows, pigs, or goats, right? How back in your ancestral line, where do you want to pick that up? Were they fish eaters or vegetarian? Did they bake a wheat bread, right? Wheat is indigenous to Europe, parts of the Middle East and Asia, but it's not native to Africa. So did they eat yam? There's two kinds of rice strains in the world. One is Asian, one is African. Or did they eat maize? Or how hot or spicy? And we're talking hot could be from chili peppers, but spicy actually could be old world spices. Did they use a lot of nutmeg or cumin or cinnamon or those kinds of spices in their foods? And so how far do you want to go back when you consider decolonizing your food, particularly when the world's food ingredients have been so mixed up for so long? Some choices to consider. What did you eat growing up? Do you eat what you like or what you see in TV ads? Are you eating a trend? Do you want to eat elaborate meals or do you want to eat simply? So even when we look at our ancestral line, like you can pick a part of the world, but where do you want to be on the economic line? Do you want to eat like the wealthy in that area? Do you want to eat like the middle class in that area? Or do you want to eat like the poor people in that area? because there's always been the difference. In some areas of the world, it's not about a variety, it's just about more of the same thing. So if you were a wealthy king and from a royal family in Africa, you may have one or two more things than someone who of a lower class, but you would just have more of it. Where in Europe, if you were going to eat like someone wealthy, you would have more, but you will also have more of the expensive things. You would have more butter, more flour, more milk, and a wider variety of things. Most cultures historically believe that food is medicine. Even in the European construct, they're dealing with a humoral system. Many of our indigenous cultures believe that food is medicine. All when you look at Ayurvedic medicine from India, it's all about that blend. When you look at Chinese medicine, it's all about that blend. So as you were choosing to decolonize your food, how do you feel after you eat it? How do you feel after you eat now? Is it healthy for you? If you're eating a grain and it is not sitting well with you, do you look back and say, well, was this grain grown where the majority of my DNA comes from? If you're lactose intolerant, did my people historically raise Northern European cattle? So it is a lot to consider. It's a lot to think about. As we talk about decolonizing, I think that for me, each of us has to define that for ourselves. Each of us has to decide where in this crazy mixture of how do I do this, do I want to do this? But here are two of my favorite books that I wanted to recommend to you if you want to start taking a dive into the whole mix and whirl of the merchant traders and what happens with food and this global shift and change. Excuse me, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. It's a great book. It's very thick, I'm telling you now. So feel free to, there is an audio version, which is like a 22 plus hour listen, but it's a great book. Also, In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. Speaks to what products came out of Africa and ended up here, and also what came from the Americas and other parts of the country and ended up in Africa. So I hope that gives you some background and a place to start as we step into the series of conversations and some things to consider. So thank you for that. And let's go see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Lavada. Anyone who has questions, as I mentioned earlier, feel free to do the raise hand function or type your question in the chat. One question, let's see, that I saw pop up was, what was the name of the book that you were describing, the book that you mentioned that describes New Netherland?
Oh, A Description of New Netherland by Adrian van der Donk.
Huh.
It's available on Amazon.
All things are.
Yeah.
One question that I was thinking about is kind of what do you think, the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum, what would a meal have been like at Dykeman and who would have cooked it?
We know a lot of what would have been available to Dykeman, the kinds of food. So we do have that mixture of the Dutch base and the English, and Northern Europeans are pretty much eating a lot of the same things. So what happens is around here, depending on your wealth, and because people really are living that humoral system, a basic meal would have started like, say, dinner. So we have breakfast, we have dinner, we have supper. Dinner is your main meal of the day. Depending on how active people are, breakfast can be leftovers. The Dutch were known for enjoying rasped cheese on bread, like cheese toast, right? Hot chocolate is consumed for a breakfast drink. So you get your big push of caffeine right in the morning. And we do know that many New York traders actually brought cacao from South America, from Brazil over to the Netherlands, had it refined, and then brought it back here. So chocolate is available. And it was also given to enslaved women. Like often we have a number of records that speak to it being a cup of hot chocolate giving as a restorative to an enslaved woman after she had given birth in our area. We do know that there's going to be a soup, right, for dinner. Right? It starts with the woman. So there's always a soup, meat carved, whole meat. And that's one of the shifts in training the enslaved when they come here. Because in Africa, they don't really roast whole meat unless it is a ceremony of some kind and that protein is going into the community. So here we also know that there's a consumption of a lot of fish. Now, because of the time period, there's a balance. So you want to have anywhere from 5 to 7 dishes on your dinner table. So you have a soup, you have something to roast, you could have some shellfish or some other kind of fish. And then you have vegetables that are appearing depending on the time of year, right? This time of year, we're getting into the end of the summer, we're getting into a very heavy and rich period. So you would probably have some kind of cabbage and fresh carrots. We know things like they put a lot of herbs in their food. So cabbage, carrots with some onion and parsley. Pies are very popular, but pies and puddings and tarts are not necessarily sweet. They're side dishes. So many of them are like souffles in a crust. So you can have the spinach souffle. So this time of year, we also are having a lot of eggs, and you're going to enjoy those eggs because they're starting to wean down, right? You know, the chickens are going to stop laying pretty soon. So, and then so that would be one course. Now you could in fact have multiple courses, or for dinner, you could just end with a sweet, right? So you would have some kind of small cakes, right? We would call them cookies, but there's also afternoon tea. New York was very known for having sometime around 4 o'clock. We always think of afternoon tea starting in England. In fact, it started in the Netherlands, was brought here, was a regular activity. Even Alexander Hamilton had tea every day with his landlady. So it's a cup of tea in the afternoon with a little butter or bread or some kind of cake or cookie. Then you would have supper, and then supper could be leftovers. But a lot of the styles that we cook here, what we call the American diet, so that's roasting a squash and stuffing it, having some kind of mixture of like beets with onions or sauteed grains. All of those foods were actually available in the 18th century going into the 19th century. So it really, we eat a lot of what our ancestors in this area, at least I do, eat a lot of this time of year, because right now you're enjoying the bounty of what is fresh. So you're not putting a lot of sauces and things on it. And you're starting to put away things also then for the winter, because, you know, it's just around the corner. But this is a real bountiful period for us.
Thank you. I see Noelle Lee Okoth has their hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, hi, thank you. This has been fabulous. I just love the whole presentation. Just how you connected everything. I have a question about the earlier period when things sort of started traveling around the world. I was always sort of taught this, the Portuguese and the Spanish were really out ahead, and they did this amazing stuff, and they figured out how to get to those places. And just a couple of years ago, I started putting it together that that's where the Moors were. And at that period, only the Arabs had celestial navigation. And they started thinking, that's why they didn't come up with it. And they just won't give credit to the people who really did. Right. But I'm wondering if that makes sense to you, or I just...
No, it does, because it's actually one of the things that comes off the Silk Road are two things. It's the astrolabe and the compass. So when I speak to, and I have to remember to speak to the navigational tools, because that was those tools helped them figure out the winds and the currents and navigating by the stars. So it is all, it is technology it's navigational technology completely. It is the astrolabe, and I never pronounced that right. And I've always wanted to learn how to read one, which is from the Middle East. It is the compass. It is the stars, the art of the astronomer. It is also a better sail for the ship and a better and different construction of the ship body itself.
Because it
So
seems like those are African and Arab technologies.
they
And we
are.
give credit to the Portuguese, but it's really because the Portuguese were already colonized by them. So I was just wondering if you would see that same connection. So
Oh, no, that connection does exist. And I just didn't mention it.
Cool.
So
Fantastic. Thank you. I've
because,
always wondered.
yeah, no, because they are, but also please understand that the Venetians, that's one of the keys that gets the Venetians on the water earlier as well, because they take the long way round at first to get into the India, into the Middle East, and to bring some of that knowledge around navigation back to them. But it is through the Moors, but it's more than just the Moors, right? It's the Moors, it's the Jews, and it is some of the early Christians kind of working together. But that technology is also, some of that's also coming out of China. So it is all that old world technology moving its way into the new world. Because it is just through this period that, Europe is coming out of its quote unquote dark ages, right? But so what does that dark age mean? It really means that they were not technologically advancing because the peoples themselves were moving further and further over. So the further away they got from where those centers of learning were, which are in like Timbuktu or in periods of the Middle East, you see that, and it is through the Moors that is moving and changing. They go into Italy, they go all through there, going across Gibraltar into Portugal and into what is Spain. And that's the Renaissance.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat that says, Lavada, can you speak to what people might have been drinking at various times and places? I know you mentioned hot chocolate, but
it depends on the part of the world you're in. So let's start with Asia. So of course, tea is in China. Tea is in Japan. We have wine. Wine is actually found around the world, that whole fermentation thing. So in Japan, you have plum wines, fruited wines, the rice wines. You have that in China as well. As you go into Africa, you have palm wine. So they're tapping the trees, they're fermenting that, they have beers. Everyone around the world for medicinal reasons is doing some variation on a boiled herb, like your herbal tea, what we would call a tinsin, or your herbal teas. Those are really consumed all over the world by people for medicinal purposes. The distillates are based, all of the wines or distillates are based on what is available. So in Europe, you have the development of beer, right? Because that's where the grains and things are for beer. In Africa, you have mead. The Arab countries, you have a lot of fruit juices, right? Because people are, where the fruits grow, people are drinking those juicy fruits, right? So you have the citrus fruits being used. You have a lot of the fruit juices being used in the Arab world, and in India. India's drinking a lot of yogurt drinks, right? And those milk-based drinks, because they've got all the cattle and they're not eating them. You have wine growing in wine being throughout the Middle East and into Italy and things, right? You can look back to biblical texts. So you have those things where they're growing. Here in the Americas, we see some native tribes are predominantly drinking water, but we do know they did some level of fermentation, that's souring, but they're not doing the metal distilling. The still actually is a creation of the Arabs, and they're doing that for the waters like rose water, orange flower water, and for perfumes and things. And so those then, that whole evaporation process builds and expands in different parts of the world. Again, that technology being moved. And then that becomes the stills that start the distillation of whiskeys and different kinds of grains being distilled, where you also then have that wine technology starting, but you also have the distillate of grappa, like the grape seeds that's happening. And so that will turn into the beers and they do that with apples and the calvadoses and the brandies and the grappas and all of that. So people are drinking a lot of things. Tea comes in first, and that starts to move. We find coffee in Ethiopia, right? Some shepherds' goats get a little buzz, and what are they doing? And so we have the development of coffee happening. And it is that those three bitter drinks going into Europe at pretty much in the same time, chocolate, coffee, and tea, that pushes that desire for sugar, right? Because sugar starts out as a medicinal, and then it starts to sweeten other things. But the Arab market, since it was developed, sugar is a Middle Eastern product perfected by the Persians, gets moved and stolen. But that's one of the reasons why that desire is, because those bitter drinks are coming in, and they're very bitter. If you've never, some of them are very bitter, to like straight chocolate is very bitter if you've never had it that way. Got to put a little sugar in there, right? So all of that then is happening. So people are drinking different things, and they bring that here, right? So, we have very early the technology to take molasses and do that distilling of that into rum. We have wine being moved, like Madeira is like heavy, and that's a wine then that's fortified with a brandy to stop the fermentation process. So that makes its way over. But we also, in a number of manuscript cookbooks here in New York, have recipes for making champagne, right? And then we have the ciders from the apples also coming out of Northern Europe. So a lot of people are drinking different things at different point in times, right? Depending on where they are. But almost everyone has some kind of fermented beverage. Then that in that fermentation does become an alcohol base. And then everybody has some variation of an herbal tea. Even if they're not drinking true Camellia sinensis Chinese tea, they're drinking some kind of herbal concoction, right? Because that is both pleasure and that is medicinal. Or they're doing that with some of the old world spices, but those kinds of hot drinks are around. And, always water, until we get, to the point that we're polluting our water by throwing human waste in it, depending on where you're living. Because that's one of the joys of coming to the new world, is that clean, fresh water.
Okay, I think we've got time for two more questions. I see Liz Ritter has her hand up. I'm going to ask the question in the chat first, and then we'll get to Liz. What native plants or herbs, are there native plants or herbs that we might find wild today in New York City that were available in the 17th century? Were things like mulberries and nettle around then?
Yes, they were. There are people who lead foraging classes. There was a guy, what was his name, Wild Bill or something like that, for years and years and years. I think I'm dating myself, but there are people who do lead foraging activities in Central Park and in different parts of New York. So you can forage for things. And there are a number of books, and I'm sorry I didn't. Oh, yes, Wild Man Steve Brill. Thank you very much. So it was Wild Bill. It's Wild Brill. Yeah, but he used, I think he's like older than I am, so I don't know if he's around anymore. But there are people who do that. There are a lot of nature groups who do that. You'll find foraging really for pretty much anything, for different plants, and there are people who forage for fungi and teach people how to do that. I would say look at any of your continuing education spaces or those adult education classes, the community colleges in your area. If you have any kind of historic food group in your area, they may know someone who's leading one in your area. But yeah, there are around, and there are a number of books that are just straight up, this plant is from here, and this is its origin, and this is when it arrived. And I didn't list any of those, but you can find a lot of that information on Amazon. Just look for books around food origins.
Thank you. And I see Liz Ritter has her hand up.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm driving, so I can't figure out how to lower my hand. So if you could do that for me. You actually answered my question. I was super curious about where rum came from and who started doing rum first, given that that sugarcane is an old world thing, but then it went to the new world.
Turn right onto New York 59 East.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But that was just really interesting to realize that it kind of came from both. So
yeah, no, once you learn the art of distilling, you can just like distill anything, right? Because it still just does its thing, right? But it started out as for perfume, and then over time, they just find out, so what creates the mash? So that's what the thing that you're distilling called, right? When it's grain-based, it's called the mash. But we need to replace that with something. So you're getting all the sugar and you got all this waste. What are we going to do with this, right? So, can we distill it? Like, can we mix it with some water? And like, what will this do? And then we get rum, right? But they do that with potatoes, and we end up with vodka and, all sorts of things over the time period. But the art of distilling moves very quickly through human technology and history.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Lavada. As always, this was really a really fantastic discussion. Love listening to you always.
Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming. Gifts in any amount are always appreciated. I'd like to also remind you that this was the first of 3 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Join us right here on Zoom next Wednesday, September 21st at 6:30 p.m. for Food Justice is More Than Just Growing Food and Feeding People by Karen Washington. Be sure to register through the link in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening. And thank you.
Bye, everyone.